Is this one on? Yes. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We're so excited. So, as Liz kind of teased, we went from being put in a room together and not knowing each other to building this game over 2 years, or I guess a year and a half to 2 years. And I'll kind of start off, I guess, the narrative a bit about kind of where we came from, what were our interests intellectually, artistically at the beginning. And then we'll kind of pass it around. As you heard, we have 7 people in our collective, so we all come from very different backgrounds and kind of contributed kind of specific parts, but always came together around this concept in I think a really beautiful way. Well, this is just some photos from last play session, and there's us, all 7 of us. So first, we're going to play an intro video that we also are posting online, and it's kind of part of the game, and it sets a scene a bit about what our interests are, and is like a preview a bit before you get into play. So we'll start there, and then I'll pick up the microphone again and talk more freely.
When humans interact with other humans, they produce emotional outpour all the time. More often than not, it simply flows out of humans with nowhere to go, leaving humans feel drained. Emotional Futures is a game that allows humans to turn draining encounters into a source of wealth. By mastering the rules of this game, humans can win real emotional rewards. The game gives humans the tools to capture the value of their emotional outpour. The game converts this value into economic data. This data is accounted for in 3 currencies: blood, sweat, and tears. Through the accumulation of blood, sweat, and tears, humans alchemically generate their Emoxys, their very own emotional proxies. Humans feed their Emoxy to materialize their emotional future. Human, your emotional future is waiting for you. What are you waiting for?
So there you see some of the game elements that will come back around, and we'll talk about different parts of them, including the Emoxy and the blood, sweat, and tears and things like that. But I think I'll start a little bit more from the beginning. So we met in this hackathon at 𝐸𝓃𝒃𝓁. And in that kind of insane 36 hours, we were interested in a few things. One of the things that we were talking about a lot was this concept of emotional labor and how it's very popularized and also very powerful politically, but also kind of has become almost a trope a bit in some of our ways of interacting with each other. But we did find a lot of inspiration. For instance, you can see here in the work of Silvia Federici and her movement, feminist movement, started in 1972, called Wages for Housework. At the same time, we were also thinking about ways that tech companies and we're kind of trying to monetize and categorize our psyches and our psychologies into kind of gamified ways online, like through self-help apps. And there's many, many of them. So these were kind of 2 interests of ours, and I have to note that in the hackathon, the ideology we were enacting was capitalism. So we actually were quite successful. Part of the reason maybe we got here, unfortunately or fortunately. And we started asking, kind of thinking about those interests we had, like what if we actually took this discourse seriously and to the extreme? What if we actually tried to monetize something that's unquantifiable, such as emotional labor that is exchanged between us? And so we came up with kind of the farce of what if we had a tier coin. So this is kind of where we came from, and we came up with this whole kind of now outdated for where we've come, but language around a tier coin and quantifying our emotional labor through drops and kind of imagining what would it mean if we started to exchange currencies around our emotional labor. So fast forward to a residency at Cali's, which was about 8 months ago, and we kind of returned to this interest in some of these themes, and we're thinking more about the ways our psychologies get mapped, reduced, commodified for profit, and then in turn how we internalize that message and start to view ourselves through those lenses. And that's where we kind of started to coalesce around the name Emotional Futures, kind of thinking like how could we parrot some of the discourse of financialization to create this kind of game world where we could kind of play out and test out what this would feel like and look like. And so that's how we came to coalesce around Emotional Futures. And I think I'd also like to note at that moment too, we really started to think about what are ways that we can kind of artistically and aesthetically express this kind of extraction of our own selves in our social relations that goes into how we enter the world in this kind of discourse around emotional labor. And that's where we started to think in terms of blood, sweat, and tears, which are the currencies of our game. And I think they represent the kind of bodily labor that goes into playing. And obviously it's a game, so it becomes fun. But in this kind of merging of these intellectual interests and these aesthetic interests, we started to coalesce around this idea of the computational occult as the kind of foundation for what we wanted to express through Emotional Futures.
I'm going to be talking a little bit on our research process. So based on basically what Andrew just presented to us, the conceptual frame that we all agreed on, we have quite some different disciplinary background, and we did basically quite a long process of collaborative research that consists of a lot of collective reading, also a lot of like testing, also with both within ourselves and also with the generous help of people from LAS and also some students from the Design Academy Eindhoven. At the end, we draw different theoretical references from psychology, cognitive science, critical science and technology studies, design theories, and blah, 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 a bunch of other disciplines that we can't even name. And we mostly collect references that are related to topics like modeling, datafication, also of course, our central topic of emotion, try to problematize that financialized logics behind how emotions are being quantified and evaluated, and also a lot of real-world scenario and applications, market applications of, for example, such as self-help apps that we mentioned, and also such as facial recognition that are used in techno-governance models in decision-making process. Among one of the many models we find, I think the next one. So these are some of the examples of like some of the models that we actually find. We basically collected many different models that some are generated empirically and some were later used for those applications that we just mentioned. These are some examples, and oh, sorry, the previous slide. One of it is like a mathematical model, and in the middle you have like a model of emotion for facial expression, and this is from the 90s and it's still being used. And on the right side you have the more like commonly known one about emotional intelligence, and this is also from the 90s and still being used a lot in our pop culture discourse, and also in a lot of different real world like application with apps and stuff. So one of the central model we have is that we later use is the Plutchik's well of emotion. This is developed by Robert Plutchik, and it was developed at the time as in some way like quite an evolutionary idea about like how to easily like identify and understand your emotion. With it's one of the most commonly used models still to understand what kind of base emotions that humans have and how to categorize them. And it is also at the time like the original idea was quite evolutionary, like focus on it's not only, it does not really take into account generalize about culture, but also it is said to be like something that also apply to all animals, including humans. So based on this, we come up with like our major model that we are using for the game as like the emotional well we have in the game for the player to choose one of the emotion from the well to engage with their counterpart, their game partner. Next slide, thank you. So these are also some of the models that we try to engage with in the game. Many of them at the end, we decide to condense our research process on different emotional models into this what we call relationships in the game. We condense these different theoretical references, models into different shapes, and we use it to as different basis for activation and evaluation of the emotions. And we basically display them in the game with increasing complexity in the game, so you can slowly go into the more complex model of activating and engaging with your own emotion and your partner's emotion.
So we have 4 of us here,
Are thought forms
and two of our people are. Can we go back? And 2 of them are online. So first we're going to hear 𝐸𝓂𝒃𝓁, and she recorded her voice with beautiful slides, and then we'll hear Steph talk about the sound contributions.
Relationships are thought forms that shape the way we relate to our emotions. In the game, they function as devices that produce and capture the emotional liquids. In collaboration with Roubuche Studio, the illustrators that we were working with, we designed them as abstracted shapes that look almost like self-grown organs or seeds you implant in yourself. The game is written from the perspective of a computer that views the human as an operational system. So we wanted the relationships to appear fluid in nature while still alluding to a mechanical system that followed a rather rigid logic. The relationships are based on 8 different models of emotion. For example, relationship 2, split, is based on the Cartesian split, the body-mind dualism that is often referred to in pop science or self-help literature, which opposes emotion with ratio. For example, the theory of the split brain hemisphere, which is completely discredited, but still used a lot because it is so seductive. Relationship 5, organs, is based on the 5-element theory in traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, according to which each emotion is associated with a pair of organs in the body. Relationship 6, expression, is based on Ekman's facial action coding system, FACS, that proposes that a set of universal emotions can be decoded through a taxonomy of human facial movements. Relationship 8, labor, is based on Hochschild's theory, which defines emotional labor as the management of feeling to create a publicly observable facial and bodily display that is sold for a wage. The models were used as a basis to design different forms of interaction between the players that are supposed to activate the emotional output. So these interactions prompt players to bring up memories, generate immediate experiences, and reflect on how they produce and process the chosen emotion. The enactment of the models through these exercises is meant to also provide a way to test how these theories condition self-perception. A central element to both games and performance is the design of rule systems, scripts, and scores that enable and guide action. Here our aim was to find a minimal form, the bare bones that the participant can flesh out. So we asked ourselves, What is the least structure needed to create emergent gameplay and lead participants into an experience with which they can surprise themselves? The activations are performed in conversation. In the accounting phase, players are asked to rate this interaction individually. This is the moment where the models are turned into schemes of evaluation. The subdivisions of the models correspond to evaluation steps that the players need to go through. A crucial part of the game is for players to experience the violence and absurdity of quantifying something as unquantifiable as emotions. What is lost and what is gained in this process? Emotions are highly subjective and relational, so the measurement needed to retain that. Here, the game puts the players in a sort of prisoner's dilemma, in which they need to balance the perception of their own emotional investment with the perception of their counterparts. At first sight, the game seems to follow a common game logic that antagonizes players, but actually, the game encourages conspiratorial gameplay. The evaluation is a moment where this ambivalence is most present. On the one hand, the game proposes a rigid structure, but it is also the moment where players need to define their own interpretation and ways of relating to the given rules. Prompting players to mutually evaluate and reflect on the conditioning of subjectivity and sociality through standardized models of emotion, it also hopes to open potential pathways to change the game and move beyond its map.
This is now Steph's contribution.
We wanted to activate more than the scopic sense, which is why every activation unlocks an original piece of music. This music opens up a moment for pause and reflection while players familiarize themselves with the activation. There are 64 compositions in total for each combination of the main emotions and relationships. Each emotional landscape is written in a specific key and shares an ensemble of instruments to create recognizability and emotional attachment. The music ranges from monophonic melodies to polyphonic arrangements, embodying the growing complexity of the different relationships. Next to the music for the activations, the other sound component is the Emoxy's voice, a liquid mouthful that prompts the player to reflect on their gameplay and encourages them to move off its limited map. As the Emoxy grows, it changes the pitch and timbre of its voice.
I will talk a bit about the UX and UI of the game, which Marcel worked on a lot, but he can't be there today, unfortunately. So I took some notes to talk a bit about the logic we all came up with, and he especially focused, or like he then focused later on the production of the UI. And also thanks again to Konrad Weise for programming the whole app. So we created like this web app in different phases. So there's first an onboarding phase, which is kind of text heavy, and in this onboarding phase, the users are met with like different aspects of the game, and they get familiarized with the economic system we created, and as well introduced to the main components. In this part of the game, they have to perform small tasks like reading and then like shaking the device, or like clicking that they're a human, and like I want to realize my potential, like all these like different buttons which they have to click, which are in between bureaucratic and aspirational. Then after this initial phase of small tasks and reading, there's the second phase, which is a quiz during the onboarding, which is called the temperament quiz. And this quiz is referencing the different self-help, self-diagnose, 16 personalities, or which pop cultural figure am I online quizzes, which categorize users based on a set of questions. And in our case, these questions are kind of arbitrary, and these categories are only two. So you're either a giver or you're a taker in the end. The app is furthermore, in the rest of the app, it's oriented on different web apps and mobile apps like Alipay, Duolingo, Quizduel, or like Headspace, which are all gamified apps which play with neoliberal ideas of control and engagement. In this phase of the app, the users are confined by the user interface and are only able to make decisions which are guided by the UI. But there's a moment where the users will reveal activation card. A moment like when they chose a relationship and an emotion which they want to play with their counterpart. In this moment, the users are confronted with being abandoned by the interface. They are left alone on their own in this moment and have to find their own way how to interact and how to bring about this this task, or like this prompt they have to do. Sure, you could just like click accounting and continue the game without doing the task, but if you're if you really want to play the game, you have to find your own way to do it. Like there's a certain idea which we want to gesture towards, like that's like an adaptive kind of game structure where you have to find your own way to play with another person and their own way to relate to another person in this game. And we're trying to gesture with this towards an outside, and actually the necessity to facilitate an own infrastructure outside of like these apps for self-betterment, or also for emotional value systems surrounding emotional labor, and also for a friendship. Yeah, it might be challenging in the first rounds, but surely it will be beneficial after you played some rounds and found a way how you want to deal with this task of like finding your own way to talk to the other person or to bring about the task.
The concept of the Emoxy came from the idea that the mixed liquids of blood, sweat, and tears would create an alchemical brew, a sort of prima materia. Through physical and chemical processes, the fluid starts to coagulate, crystallize, change form, and grow, like the search for the philosopher's stone. The spiritual alchemy is happening in the sphere of the imagination, between dream imagery and the holographic reality of cyberspace. And we dreamt the stone to come to life. The creature grows with your emotional journey, as you feed it with the blood, sweat, and tears you extract from yourself. The Emoxy is what it eats. None is created or destroyed. It is you. Following the components of the game, the players sacrifice of themselves for each of their emotional encounters. In the spiritual alchemy, it is the imaginative experience that leads to the formation of the self. The Emoxy is the materialization of your emotional sacrifice and your emotional growth. The finalized, crystallized Emoxy is your acquired magical item.
As elaborated on before, the Emoxy, which is the creature you have in the game, is a proxy of your emotions. It embodies the account balance of your blood, sweat, and tears, and it guides you through your journey while playing the game. It's being fed by the emotions, and here we see the animation, how it's fed. And you need to take care of your Emoxy. It's only when you feed it, it will grow and live on, a bit like a Tamagotchi. And caring for the Emoxy ultimately means caring for yourself, or somehow also for your blood, sweat, and tears value. The Emoxy is a kind of cute, cheeky creature, like similar to other cute creatures. Motivate yourself to play a game or interact with an app, create data, even though we don't collect any data, but like surely it's the logic behind Duo, the OL of Duolingo. And it motivates you to come back to the game, play again, and actually invest in your future. The Emoxy, the Emoxys, they're not only motivating you to play the game, but ultimately they maybe even break with this logic that you're suddenly getting more interested actually into the Emoxy than into the game itself or into the external motivation of self-betterment. It ultimately enables a new motivational structure which breaks with the proposed motivational structure of the game book and allows users to find a new way to play in the game. Also, as Steph told, the Emoxy increasingly makes comments about different ways how to reflect on the game. When you play the game, you will realize that somehow your Emoxy will change based on which blood, sweat, and tear value your account balance has. There are some Emoxys and some materials which are hard to get. We made this like small, quite easy chart of how the materials are laid out in a three-dimensional space, in like it's a plane which lays in a three-dimensional space of blood, sweat, and tears. And based on this plane, your Emoxy material gets selected. So there might be players who want to get a certain texture, and then they start playing accordingly to get the specific blood, sweat, and tear value, which would create either like a crystalline tear Emoxy, which we saw earlier, or like a slimy one, or like a really gory, bloody one. And they are probably quite hard to get with conventional gameplay, but I think there's like some people already told us that there's like alchemical trickery which enables you to have like a different evaluation process after the activation to get the blood and the tear value and the sweat value you admire to have. Like, for example, this one. Ultimately, the Emoxy will go through different phases and will plateau at a certain point, and you will have these crystalline, or like these crystals growing on your Emoxy after a while, and I don't know how many rounds you have to play to get there.
It depends which relationships you use.
Yeah, like depending on which relationship you use, it could be a couple of rounds you play, and then actually you would be kind of at the end of the game, or like you would be in a stage where you could play on, but your Emoxy wouldn't morph or grow anymore, but like it would then still continue to change the texture. And we would show you after the Q&A a demonstration of one activation, and Ingeborg and me would play it together. Yeah, and then afterwards we would start with the play session.